Hello, my name is Linda Eaton, and I have the honor to serve on the TSA board. The topic for this session, on our first session on our second day, is Women, Textiles, and Politics. And so I'm only going to introduce our speakers very briefly because all of their bios and contact information is in the full conference programs. Can I ask that if you would like, and we encourage you to ask questions of our speakers, that you use the Q&A button rather than the chat box. You can chat amongst yourselves for the in the chat box, but the questions for our speakers, it would help if you could put them in the Q&A, and you can get that by at the bottom of the screen. So our first speaker, I'm delighted to introduce Chris Rudisill, who's an independent scholar and studio artist from North Carolina, the former director of Stonewall National Museum and Archives. And his talk is titled Queering the Bias, LGBTQ Quilt Making in the American South. So Chris, over to you.
So thank you so much again, Linda. Good morning, everyone. I am an artist and journalist living in North Carolina, and my work focuses on queer identity, community-based history, and the foundations of storytelling and Southern craft. Before I get started, I would like to thank fiber artist and head of the UNCC Fiber Arts Department, Mary Tuma. I believe she's on today, and thank her for inspiring me to work in textiles over and over again. In my current research, Queering the Bias, I'm exploring the history of quilting and how it can bring people together in physical or digital spaces, embracing the social and cultural impact of the craft on LGBTQ communities in the American South. In quilting terminology, true bias refers to any cut that doesn't run along a straight grain, much like the lives and experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. The project focuses on three primary areas of study: the history of quilting in the South, quilting as a tool for activism and social justice, and exploration of gender and sexual orientation through craft making. So why do we quilt? I was at a 2-week seminar in 2019 when I conceived of this project. The program was with other museum and art colleagues and focused on object-based storytelling. As an introduction, we were tasked with using an artifact from home that represented a pivotal moment in our lives and creating a story about that object as part of a story slam. Oral history is both the oldest type of inquiry and one of the most ongoing methods of sharing familial and social tradition. Jimmy Neal Smith, the founder of the International Storytelling Center in Jonesboro, Tennessee, said, "We are all storytellers. We all live in a network of stories." When I think about storytelling, I also think of the places where these stories occurred. Growing up in the South, places like front porches and churches, and in my grandmother's quilting room. Imagine quilting as a medium for storytellers, connecting generations through touch and movement, passed down from one generation to another. Quilts are filled with the stories of how they were made, who made them, where the quilt was used, or on whose bed it lay. Was it made for the birth of a child or for a wedding? Was it passed down through generations of family or through a circle of friends? As I've explored narratives in my work, these memories of quilting kept creeping back into my periphery. I produced this framed piece of a handmade quilt made by my paternal grandmother that sits in my studio today. With the soft humming sounds of a sewing machine and scissors meeting fabric in the background, I shared my story of sitting in the upstairs of my grandma's house while she performed this treasured family tradition, watching, listening, while she quilted and told stories on those warm afternoons in North Carolina. She died in 2010 and left many quilts behind for her descendants. Like many others of her generation in the South, her obituary reads, "Mrs. Rudisill worked in textiles." Many of her quilts have now found a place in my home, and remnants of the craft, like many traditions passed down from generation to generation, find permanence in my work and craft making. In his new book, Why We Quilt, Thomas Nauer writes, "Today, quilting is a conspicuous choice. Quilts are no longer about material necessity, but instead fulfill other deeper needs. They provide social, cultural, aesthetic, and personal connections that are unique to each quilter. He points out the deep associations and history involved in the art of quilting, the physical comfort and memory tied to the craft, the connection between maker and recipient, and how they connect us across time and place. The making of quilts has a long history around the world, going as far back as 3400 BCE, yet the study of quilt history is relatively new. Historian Elaine Hedges has called attention to the importance of studying quilts as a means of understanding the past. From being expressions of women's private lives, testaments to their domestic allegiances, quilts also became political emblems and acts that helped women to expand their world and thus to negotiate their transition into modern times. Throughout history, the production of or work with textiles has been not only an important component of domestic and community life, but also mainly a women's sphere of activity. Women quilted for a variety of reasons: the simply utilitarian need to provide warm blankets, as recorded history of families, to represent personal and religious beliefs, to spend time with other women, and to be creative as individuals. It is personal yet communal, societal yet familial. The quilting process has been borrowed and exchanged throughout generations and cultural traditions. While quilting has emerged representative of these early traditions, it also spoke of power and wealth in the South prior to the Civil War. For elite white women of the slaveholding South, quilts communicated status and power, while enslaved women quilted either for their enslavers or for their own families, as we can see in these two examples of the Star of Bethlehem quilt. Although its provenance is unknown, the quilt on the left was likely made in the southeastern United States around 1835. Quilts like this represent one of the most popular quilt patterns of the time, with obvious reference to religious belief. The quilt on the right is a variation, quilted by two enslaved African-American women, known as Aunt Ellen and Aunt Margaret. The elaborate stitching distinguished quilts from the region and exemplified their more decorative nature in both examples, contrary to those of the North, which were at the time needed more for warmth and likely constructed of simple geometric forms. The patterns of the applique designs of the South were more graceful and delicate, and the effect pictorial. It would be impossible to cover the long history of quilting in the South, or especially its roots in slavery, or its significant cultural tradition in the history of Black Americans during this presentation. So I will only reference some of the early instances of quilting's role in social justice to help bring us further into the study of quilting's relationship to representative identity in textile work today. This includes the oral histories of the Underground Railroad quilts, quilts used to support the abolitionists, and the Reconciliation quilt here by Lucinda Ward Honsting. It is named for its references to post-Civil War history, containing 40 pictorial blocks depicting scenes of domestic, commercial, and political life in the 1860s, including one portraying a Black man on foot towering over a white man on horseback with the inscription, "Master, I am free." By the late 1800s, the growth of the Southern textile industry made affordable fabric more accessible, and the expansion of sewing machines in the consumer market made quilting faster. Racial tensions continued during this period, and some of the quilts that women of the time made speak to the unequal treatment relationships of the Jim Crow era. Quilting remained vibrant in rural communities of the South throughout the early 1900s, and as consumer culture took over urban and suburban America in the 1950s, the craft continued to be an integral part of the region, where the tradition, techniques, and stories were preserved. In their research for Quilts and Human Rights, Marcia McDowell, Mary Worrell, Lynn Swanson, and Beth Donaldson found that throughout history, quilts have portrayed almost any transgression of human rights by governments, businesses, and individuals. Quilts have examined war and atrocities, served as memorials, and become homages to honored champions of civil rights. This example by artist Devon Wells, Storytelling Quilts, documents dramatic events of the civil rights battle in the 1960s. Wells portrays harsh imagery, including the violent confrontation between police and activists on the road to Selma, the lynching of an African-American figure, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and Martin Luther King Jr. speaking at a podium in the center of the quilt. She reminds us of this dark period in American history. Centered around women's lives, quilting also shows up at the center of women's equality movements. From the quilted suffragette banners with overt assertion of identity challenging political power, to the 1975 equality quilt top, created by a group of women in California quilting class seen here. Each block exhibits the deeply layered applique story work often found in 1970s quilts. As a whole, it expands the notion of women's work, depicts the spirit of community quilting, and fits within the larger tradition of social reform quilts. The center block, which states "free to be me, you, and me," ties the historical image of a woman's place to that of the ongoing fight for equality. One of the most profound examples of quilting used to represent the human condition, or this craftism, is the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. It is likely the most prolific public community quilting project in history, and today consists of more than 48,000 individual panels representing over 94,000 people and weighs an estimated 54 tons. Imagined by Cleve Jones in 1985, the goal of the project was to bring awareness of the massive human reality of the AIDS epidemic. With each panel approximately the size of the average grave, one can visually feel the loss of human life. The very history of quilting is one that blends cultures, traditions, and the human struggle. It is a product of storytelling, memory, and symbolism, built on both the long tradition of the craft in America and the activism of previous movements. Quilting can serve as a representation and visibility of LGBTQ people working in the field today. And its history transcends quilt making, influencing fiber artists of various mediums and techniques. Like fiber artist Ramakan O. Arwister, who works primarily in crochet and ceramic sculptures, but was heavily influenced by quilting tradition. O. Arwister, and I apologize if I'm ruining his name, grew up in North Carolina and says that while hiding his queer identity from his family, he felt embraced, important, and special when making quilts with his paternal grandmother. His crochet jam events have embodied the tenderness of quilting that he experienced as a child in community-centered art projects, using fiber materials as a tie to his Southern Black roots. He states that the project is a way of calmly reclaiming my Blackness, my queerness, my Southern roots, while also imbuing my art practice with calmness, acceptance, inclusiveness, social interaction, and creativity. Referencing the state motto of his home state, "Esse cum vedere," to be rather than to seem. This transformation of communal experience shows up in other projects where personal history is embedded in the contemporary creation of the quilting bee idea, and was what made the AIDS Memorial Quilt such a powerful project. It is that community association with the craft that binds these experiences and artists. As Nauer says, precisely because quilting ties us to our fellow quilters, past and present, it prevents us from ever being entirely alone. An Army of Lovers Cannot Fail, conceived by Ginger Takahashi Brooks in 2004, invited participants to take part in traditional hand quilting regardless of skill, taking the form of a quilting bee. In doing so, Brooks harnesses the history as the foremost in political activities, community building, and dialogue, creating a sense of belonging for those who participate. The quilting forums are symbolic of the same ideals upheld by her own queer community. While redefining these traditions and reviving a historically outdated mode of production, the project brings the spirit of this shared experience to an extended community. LGBTQ quilters today form community guilds, join online Facebook groups like the Rainbow Quilt Society, and connect on Instagram to share their work, techniques, and life experiences. Quilting continues to be inherently tied to the spaces we create. As I explore the personal identity that can be drawn from quilting, both in looking at how it has affected or influenced the personal histories or histories of queer people, and how its overlapping aspects of communal, familial, and physical forms create a medium steeped in storytelling, expression, and place. I also examine my own work, embracing experimentation with quilting and visual placemaking. It requires the study of LGBTQ social history from hidden existence in the South through the tangential reality of queer people shaping rural and urban landscapes today. The region is still a stronghold of religious and conservative politics that elicit discrimination and limit the acceptance of queer representation in everyday life or through artistic expression. Author John Howard described the complex forces producing and reproducing space or place in the South. Certain acts and behaviors are acceptable in one place, unacceptable in another. What's right here may be wrong there. Notions of propriety and transgression thus shift with the site, especially across spaces we call public and private. While his research focuses on Mississippi, I believe it can be broadened across the South and have taken liberty to change his quote to reflect that regional interpretation. Distinct locales in the Southern landscape forged attitudes and sexualities as yet unexamined by queer historians. Queer Southerners, with attitudes and sexualities of their own, changed the South. They transformed the sites they occupied, the sites through which they moved, and they remade themselves, marking off space for insurgent conceptions of sex in everyday life. Erin McIntosh explores this intersection of material culture, family tradition, identity and formation, sexuality and desire, using quilting as a material dialect. A fourth-generation quilter, McIntosh works with found images from print materials like the vintage male erotica image here in Little Big Man, set against the traditional Star of Bethlehem symbol, referencing his strong familial heritage in the craft. Both his grandmothers and grandfathers were quilters. His work examines the objects, sayings, and stories of his past, questioning the larger social constructions of deviance, shame, and heteronormativity. Quilting traditions in the South also centered around familial events like weddings or new births. The common gift, the double wedding ring design, was traditionally made by mothers and grandmothers for their children and given as gifts on their wedding day or anniversaries. In this rendition, traditional queer double wedding ring quilt by artist Angie Wilson uses these traditional patterns and motifs combined with unconventional materials to construct conversations about themes of gender and community. The familiar pattern here is countered with the use of women's undergarments in lace, silk, and cotton. According to Deirdre Foley, just as characteristics of crazy quilting are integrated seamlessly into a more traditional technique, the title also gestures toward the integration of marriage equality into society. The 2014 exhibition, Queer Threads, Crafting Identity and Community, curated by John Chage at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York, brought contemporary LGBTQ fiber artists, like these and others, together to explore how the complex use of textiles give way to exploring relationships within and around LGBTQ identity, culture, and spaces. Jesse Harrod noted, the politics of cloth seem inescapable, and material and technical histories are fundamental to the choices of the maker. Quilting has been used to honor victims of violence and discrimination, like this quilt created to honor Matthew Shepard, who was murdered in 1998, to represent activist movements, and to create legacies of the organizations that have helped define our communal identity. Sapphic Spirit by Billy Piazza hangs in the offices of the Lesbian Connection, a grassroots publication founded in 1974 by the lesbian feminist collective Ambitious Amazons. It is one of the oldest continuous publications in the lesbian community, and Piazza made a series of legacy quilts from t-shirts collected over 30 years, connecting the history of the movement to this community of women. Common symbols like that of the Human Rights Campaign logo have been transformed, like the patchwork block seen here in Quilt for Equality by Eric the Quilter. It is one of the most recognizable symbols of the LGBTQ rights movement in modern day, and was also adopted, incorporating new colors to represent marriage equality. Not only are LGBTQ quilters challenging audiences, They often must challenge the spaces within the field. Maddie Curtay of the Badass Quilters Society started an online thread in 2014 called Quilters for Diversity. In the piece, she argued that the industry is painfully behind the times and urges other quilters to welcome diversity in our classes, publications, and our shops. In 2017, we saw homophobia show up in a conservative quilters group online, which made international news. It was somewhat ironic when English painter Sadie Lee coined the term quilt bag in 2006, an acronym which stands for queer, undecided, intersex, lesbian, trans, bisexual, asexual, gay. While controversial for some, it suggests a patchwork of identities and references the soft and familial connotations the memory of quilts in our history invokes. This memory is influencing both contemporary fiber artists and traditional quilters around the country, and especially in the South. They are examining these traditional forms and the heteronormative, often feminine history of the craft. Quilters are shifting the traditional understanding of handiwork, and traditionalists around the country are finding ways to redefine the personal stories and histories within. Dale Allen Rouse, better known as the Quilting Cowboy, launched a YouTube campaign in 2019 called I Am a Quilter, and hoped with his brand to break down stereotypes as to what a quilter looks like or who can quilt. While his work may be viewed as more traditional, his visibility is helping to expand the field and the conversation both for queer quilters and for larger quilting communities. I am currently spending time with 3 such quilters across the South, each with their own story and path to quilt making. Ray Holloman is a Black trans man living near Nashville. He learned to quilt from his grandmother in Camden, Alabama, just outside the famous Gee's Bend. His first quilt was a patchwork he created that referenced the Underground Railroad quilts. Today, he often gets odd looks when he enters his local quilt shop or shows up at Quilting Guild events. Russ Beasley started quilting in Atlanta during the AIDS crisis, making panels for friends he had lost, and is now using his quilting to continue a Southern family tradition of making quilts that will be passed down for generations to come. Finally, Ariana Sellers, who is here today, is an artist and educator based in Memphis, Tennessee. She grew up in Chesterfield, County, South Carolina, and does not know much about the women in her family or their history with quilting or other fiber crafts. She believes her great-grandmother Dolly likely sewed and possibly quilted based on the social norms of the region. When talking about how her quilting can connect back to this unknown family history, she says, "With the queer identity of what we do, I am doing this to get in touch with the family that I think I have, or the things that they did. If they knew me, would they approve of my life? Would we quilt together? I don't know what Grandma Dolly would have done about me, but I hope that we could have gotten along at a sewing machine." All 3 of these quilters are challenging the tradition, or more importantly, finding their place in it. We have seen the impact of quilting as one of many visual tools of activism, and there remains a strong historical and often familial tradition connecting us. But how can the storytelling and the community of quilting be changed to fill the personal, emotional, and physical needs of quilters today? How can quilting as a craft fill those same needs of our communities? LGBTQ quilters are finding ways to confront the traditions that often excluded them and create new paths to tell the stories of their experience. Stories laced with the intersection of race, culture, gender, sex, and identity. Storytelling and community quilting continue to evolve after thousands of years, and queer quilters are helping to shape its history. As Nauer states, the real story of quilting lies in our individual practices, the quilts we share, the stories behind them, and the lives those quilts become a part of. In the South, steeped with a history of textiles and filled with the stories of quilters through the heirlooms passed down and through generations of craftspeople who maintain its connection to the region, LGBTQ people are challenging the notions of who is allowed to be a quilter. They are creating new traditions of gay uncles or lesbian aunts making baby quilts. They are changing the space of the predominantly white, straight, cisgender quilting community and guilds. They are exploring their identity through textiles, color, and pattern. They are making sure there is more to see in the future of quilting. They are queering the bias. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was absolutely fascinating, and some really interesting and beautiful quilts that you showed. We do have one question in the Q&A, but I would encourage people to put other questions in there. We're going to go on to our second speaker, and then we'll take questions after Christalena talks. So Christalena Hughmanick is an artist and an educator at the Art Institute of Chicago, but she also works some of her time in Budapest, which is one of my absolute favorite cities. And her paper is entitled Freedom Quilt, Collective Patchwork in Post-Communist Hungary. So Christalena.
I'm going to start by just speaking a little bit about the project that I did in Hungary. It was a year long. But first, I'm going to go into some detail about the material that I used and that material history to contextualize the project. So quick recap of the things that happened in this region in 1989. The Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and its satellite states returned to being independent nations. As a result of these political changes, many countries in the East European bloc experienced a lifted ban on social gatherings, and in Hungary, the Hungarian Patchwork Guild, which I'll now refer to as HPG going forward, formed through a government-issued grant. 30 years later, in 2019, and with a US grant designed for creative projects celebrating the 30th anniversary of the liberation, I revived this moment of awakening by joining forces with the HPG, the US Embassy in Budapest, and members of the Hungarian public. My intention was to investigate a present-day relationship to democracy and freedom in Hungary's developing capitalist economic system, by opening a space for uncensored conversation around individual lived experience. And I also will apologize for my pronunciation of Hungarian in advance. This project developed organically out of 9 months of research through a Fulbright grant to follow the evolution of Hungarian kékfestő fabric. I sought to understand how the country's alternating political regimes and border changes affected the materials production and role in the broader economy during the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century as it relates to imperialism, and the 1949 Soviet-led industrialization of the textile industry as it relates to nationalism. The project allowed me to work with some of the producers, a little bit about its steps include printing a resist dye paste onto cotton with copper inlaid blocks, which you can see here. Then submerge dyeing it in indigo vats. And finally, removing the resist agent to reveal repeat patterns on blue or black cloth, depending on how long it was submerged in the indigo. Through studio visits with 3 of the 6 remaining family-owned kékfestő producers in Győr, Csicekecske, and Nagynyáred, I learned that the 400-year-old tradition experienced fluctuating levels of creative freedom and oppression imposed by different ruling governments. As Hungarians continually reckon with their national identity following multiple occupations, the many ethnicities in and around the country have used it to exhibit their heritage through displays of folk art and national costume. I followed this line of inquiry back 180 years to an example of its use in protest and labor histories that contextualizes the Freedom Quilt, which is primarily made up of this material. In 1841, Hungarian noblewomen wore garments made of the cloth, displaying government-issued patterns depicting the word honi, which translated to just one in Hungarian at that time. A sample of the original cloth and print block can be found in the Goldberger Museum in Budapest, which was once the country's largest textile factory and one of the oldest sites of production in the region. This was understood by Hungarians as an act of protest against Hungary's impending reliance on Austrian textile producers as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was about to form under the Habsburg monarchy. As the production grew within the broader textile industry, hundreds of family-run dye houses formed, and the material became a lucrative export until the Soviet occupation. Most dye houses were then shut down or became property of the state, on occasion forced to dye uniforms for factory workers and manual laborers. In Hungary today, you see the decorative blue and white patterned material everywhere as souvenirs for tourists. But if you look closely, you may also notice Budapest city parking inspectors and the public transport system employee uniforms remain in this iconic blue color, which I saw as a contemporary symbol of governmental power intersecting with craft. In Hungary today, quilt practitioners often use the fabric as a base for their technically impressive works, linking this enduring aspect of folk heritage with contemporary quilting. I partnered with the Guild because of its initiatives of free education, community building, and an unforeseen linkage to US quilting traditions that is evident in the organization's formation. American-based International Quilt Association opened an exhibition in Salzburg, Germany in 1988 that influenced the foundation of patchwork guilds across Europe. After participating, Anna Dolanyi, pictured here with one of her quilts, and Sorolta Chaka began a patchwork movement in Hungary by inviting 1,300 quilters from 27 countries to send album quilt blocks that toured Hungary as completed quilts, thus teaching people about the practice and forming the guild. The quilt was later auctioned to benefit the Hospice Foundation of Anna's hometown in Debrecen, solidifying the group's dedication to charity work that can be seen in recent projects such as Quiltmaking for flood survivors and quilted pillows for breast cancer patients. In this instance, the term guild is utilized in a manner that refers to, quote, characters and values neglected by our modern world, such as solidarity, quality, and community that is open for all, end quote, creating a social space of inclusion through national and international exhibition opportunities. When someone joins the guild, they sew a quilt block that gets added to this guild letter quilt, which you can see, representing their entire membership at national events. This 500 all-female organization, with the exception of 2 men currently, acts as an umbrella under which there are 60 groups in 8 regions of the country, each functioning as an independent unit. Although there is a nominal membership fee, which is equivalent to $20 to $25 US dollars, based on income, participation in all events is free of charge, and an abundance of technical information can be gleaned from online forums, a quarterly newsletter, and social media outlets. This organizational structure thus subverts traditional methods of education and the manner of many craft practices by sharing information freely without a monetary exchange. In the current political climate in Hungary, I saw an immediate need for conversation around art making in relation to the state of governance. Critical analysis in all sectors, including the contemporary art scene, is being dismantled by Viktor Orbán as he closes spaces and replaces institutional figures that exhibit what is considered to be liberal or leftist artworks, leaving a narrow margin of acceptable genres to work within. I had rich conversations around censorship and the ability for folk arts to endure because they are considered non-threatening with my graduate seminar that I taught at the Mihaly Nagy School of Design in the textile department. At the exact moment Budapest was experiencing its largest ever public protests against newly signed labor laws and the government organization that controls media, the MTVA. I was deeply moved by the honest conflict of these talented young women to stay in a country that does not support their emerging art practice or leave their home. So I presented a call for participation at the HPG annual conference in May of 2019, in which members were asked to create 40 by 40 centimeters quilt blocks using a majority of cake festive cloth, with the hopes that I would receive enough to make a quilt. My call quickly circulated through their well-connected community, resulting in approximately 90 blocks arriving in my mailbox by midsummer of that year. As an attempt to imagine the work's final outcome, I laid the blocks out in continually changing arrangements and began to recognize many of the piecing and applique patterns from the Amish quilting tradition in my hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was also clear that cake festo prints were used, some of which were printed many years ago, can be identified with specific producing families and dye houses, creating another layer of pattern specificity. To achieve the project goals of accessibility and free speech, a series of 8 3-hour quilt block making workshops were held free of charge at the U.S. Embassy American Corners locations in Debrecen, Veszprém, Budapest, Szeged, Pécs, as well as the Brody House Studios and the Moholy Nagy College campus in Budapest, all locations where English is often spoken. The practice of album quilting, in which contributions from different people are combined into one quilt, can be found at many points in history, and it was crucial that this project reflected diversity and perspective with minimal aesthetic restrictions beyond the use of the Hungarian cloth. To foster cultural exchange and inspire their block imagery, I lectured on political histories in the US with a focus on the role quilts played in both war and recording minority culture identity. Examples in which quilt patterns intersected with the actual idea of freedom were highlighted, such as the commemorative Revolutionary War Battle of Bourgogne pattern that visually depicts American soldiers closing in on British troops to win the war. Civil War cot quilts were made to fit over a sleeping soldier's body and were then used to wrap their bodies in a quick burial. According to oral accounts passed down through families, pattern-coded African-American freedom quilts played a powerful role in guiding slaves to free territories on the Underground Railroad. This was new information to most of the participants, and they were really thrilled to learn about it. So following this veiled American history lesson was basic sewing and applique instruction so that participants could create a block based on the prompt, "What does freedom mean to you?" I presented examples of textiles that were present in an historical moment of shifting power structures, the ephemeral object of the quilt pointing to perforations in someone's life. Women came from all corners of Hungary, Romania, Serbia, and Croatia to attend the workshops, regardless that they were being held in English. So I quickly enlisted help from my hosts at the US Embassy locations and hired my Hungarian friends to translate this incredibly difficult language during these workshops. The workshops were designed and advertised to inexperienced sewers, drawing a diverse crowd of students, activists, and artists, but HPG members always showed up in large groups, despite having already submitted quilt blocks through the mail. They came in groups of friends, mother-daughter pairs, and small guild groups, consistently early and eager to meet the Americans so deeply fascinated with their community. I was often met with a very confused, "I thought you would be older." I was particularly struck by a small group in Szeged that brought me to their town community center to see the work. When I asked how so many quilts had accumulated, they said they preferred to gift their work as a gesture of love instead of entering an economic system. They are making to give and for the public to view. Many older women that I met expressed in one-on-one conversations a nostalgia for the Soviet era because it provided more time in their schedules for family quilting and self-care. Now they rely on each other to have more time in their schedules to do both. The youngest participant was aged 4, the oldest 93, and therefore some have had this experience of making quilts through both of the recent political regimes. They listened to my lectures, they had personal conversations with me, and they were a bit reluctant to speak about politics in the presence of one another. So it was only in these private conversations that they expressed their political positions. These are some examples of the collected blocks. Both of these are from the Guild. It's surprisingly common for women in this group to have such a high level of technical skill. This block on the left is from Penny Szabo. She designed it based on the New York City skyline. And the block on the right was made to commemorate Hungary joining the European Union in 2004. This block on the left says, both are you free and you are free. Following this series of workshops, the 256 collected blocks were stitched together during a 4-day Quilting Bee event at the Skansen Open Air Ethnographic Museum in Szentendre. The event was modeled on the American Western Expansionism era quilting bees, in which geographically distant pioneer women gathered to top stitch one person's quilt top together in order to speed the process. This format was also used in African American freedom quilting bees in Alabama during the 1960s so that women could raise money for their families and civil rights organizations. Historically, this meeting space for slow handwork inherently lends to the sharing of skills, news, and practical information in a very social manner. These moments of slow stitching allowed time for updates on everyone's children, jobs, and recent vacations, but very rarely was the topic of politics breached. Mostly they were curious about why I was spending all my time in a foreign country without any family and started to invite me to meet their own. I started to understand that the connection between their daily lives and patchwork could be traced to the etymological root of the term bee, which means service, prayer, and helping a neighbor. Over the course of the 4-day event, I was joined by various combinations of HPG members on each day to help with the quilt construction. In keeping with the concept of democracy, a majority vote process was implemented to make decisions like what blocks to include, their arrangement, and whether to top stitch by hand or machine. The objective was to give each person donating their time an equal amount of ownership over the final outcome by distributing the power of choice evenly. With each new step, we paused for a conversation and a vote. A natural expert would emerge to guide and teach the group, with museum visitors looking on and sometimes becoming involved in our lively conversations. As you might imagine, the most contentious decision was whether to hand or machine top stitch the quilt. We started by hand and ended up using machines in the interest of time. But we did hand-based using the spoon method. Within each combination of women, I witnessed consistent, deep respect between them, based on their shared love of quilting and the many years they spent watching one another's craft and families evolve. When President Ildiko's husband arrived with pastries for us one morning, all women greeted him with a familial manner, and he stayed until the end to help me pack up, which goes back to the Guild's initial objective of inclusion for everyone and helping. Within this process, we took part of the quilt outside and stitched on it, kept one half on the inside, and we completed 4 sections that were 2 by 4 meters in size. This was the first time we got to see the sections together and have a sense of what the final outcome would look like. The next series of events were designed around releasing the Freedom Quilt publication and exhibition of the quilt. The book was made as an artifact to document the process and people that contributed to the project. Designed by Ryan Ingebrigtsen, this risograph edition of 100 copies doubles as a catalog to accompany exhibitions of the quilt and a functional instructional pattern book for experienced quilters to remake 12 of the blocks made by HPG members that are in the quilt. It also has a project essay written by myself. The design of the book is based on the very concept of quilting and its many levels of process. We aim to reduce the complexities of this highly structured practice to simple visual forms in order to highlight the moments in the process that personal choice makes the final product so unique to its maker. And I held a book release at Riso Plant Studio in Budapest, where the book was printed. Many of the participants that had engaged in the project came and took a book. These are some of the students. Upon returning to the US, the quilt and the book were exhibited at Andrew Rayfitt's gallery in Chicago in February of 2020. During the international COVID-19 lockdown, I released a free PDF download of the book in the spirit of the quilters I worked with that preferred gifting over the exchange of money. To date, it has been downloaded 80 times from people in 20 countries, and I continually receive images of remade blocks for circulation on the project's social media outlets. Additionally, I published written essays about American quilting pattern sources for the Guild's last 4 quarterly newsletters. They asked me to do this as a follow-up to the workshops. Because of their short 30-year history with Patchwork, they wanted to better understand the cultural sources of the patterns they were using. This is the final quilt. This project, as well as my work in general, is motivated by the possibility of an object, a quilt, to function both as a tool for individual expression and political dissent. The range in imagery contributed to the quilt seemed to fall between traditional adherence to pattern and overt political commentary, with the expression of identity being most evident through in-person conversations. I felt that my goal of consciously complicating situations by opening space for these conversations was met with a level of receptivity that I could not have anticipated. People wanted to tell me their stories, but in intimate ways. It began with the Cake Festo producers and continued with my art students, HPG members, workshop attendees, onlookers to the Quilting Bee, and anyone else that encountered this project along the way. The response was overwhelming, and I was continually reminded of the value of the Guild places on, quote, characters and values neglected by our modern world, such as solidarity, quality, and community that is open for all. In the end, this attitude encompassed all the interactions I had carrying out this project and taught me something true about Hungarian culture. I hope that this object can exist as a record of personal exchanges and an archive of human stories while continuing to be exhibited as a symbol of temporal union, international exchange, and the fortitude of Hungarian quilting communities. And there is my info if you'd like to follow up on the project.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Christalena. And you've got 2 people asking the same question, which is, what is the spoon method that you referred to?
The spoon method is for when you're basting your sandwich layers. So the top layer of the quilt, the batting middle layer, and then the back layer. You baste, which is large stitches that are temporary. You take them out after the top stitching. It just keeps everything in place while you're top stitching. So there is this method where you lay it flat and the needle goes in and out, and you use the very tip of a spoon to pull the tip of the needle up so that you can grab it with your other hand. So instead of going from the top to the bottom of the quilt, you can just go across the top. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, you've got a couple of questions. One is from Cynthia Fowler. Hi, Cynthia. And she says, I had the opportunity to see Queer Threads in Boston, and I'm wondering if you might direct us to other exhibitions, other similar exhibitions. And she's also thinking about the tension between the sometimes radical politics of queer crafters that includes serious critique of the museums and the need for queer visibility in exhibitions. And so do you have thoughts about that?
Sure. I think, first off on Queer Threads, that exhibition continues in various forms. I think the most recent iteration is Queer Threads Curious Spaces, which is, and I haven't checked recently, but I think that it's been turned into some online programming in DC that was a coordination between the American University, George Washington University, and the Textile Museum. So that show concept actually does continue and has created various exhibitions off of it. The other, as far as directly queer fiber exhibitions, I'm not aware of any at the moment. I will say that many fiber exhibitions are more inclusive now of LGBTQ quilters. We've seen that, as well as LGBTQ exhibitions being more inclusive of fiber art and quilting. Especially, there were tons of exhibitions across the country in 2019 with the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. So, we saw museums across the country that developed exhibitions focused on the LGBTQ community in a big way. And that was from history museums to fine art museums, centered around that anniversary. With 2020 being the way it is and what has happened since, I'm unsure of where that will go. I had expected to see a lot of programming in 2020 as well, being the 50th anniversary of the Pride Festival that followed Stonewall. But with a lot of those events canceled, I didn't see a lot of that programming turning to virtual with the time frame that happened between March and June. So I hope to see more of that throughout the next few years. I hope to see, of course, more representation of LGBTQ quilters, not only in their own exhibitions, but in other exhibitions of fiber arts too. As far as the politics of queer crafters and the museum specifically, there's been a lot of tension with Leslie Lohman. Primarily, its history was built around gay men in big ways. It was built around gay male imagery in a lot of ways. I saw it evolve over the past 10 years with more inclusiveness of the full sphere of LGBTQ identities and full spectrum. However, they changed their name last year and took out gay and lesbian and didn't add queer or LGBTQ or anything else, just went with Leslie Lohman Museum, which again sparked a lot of protests and anger, saying that it was erasing the identity altogether. So I think it's yet to be seen what the future of that museum holds. I think I personally witnessed, I think, more inclusiveness of the full queer community over the past 2 years from that museum, but we'll see. I don't like to make judgments on other museums specifically, but we'll see.
So there's another question for you, Chris, is that Kevin Cosbab, sorry if I'm wrecking your name, but he's noticed that there are many straight male quilters who brand themselves with language highlighting their masculinity. Do you see queer quilters responding or reaching to this hetero norm activity?
No, I haven't. I mean, I'm sure it's happening. I think I'm actually a member of the Quilting Dudes. As an example, there's a Facebook group called Quilting Dudes, which I know other LGBTQ quilters are part of. I've not seen any overt homophobia in those groups. I've actually seen the opposite. There was and I can't nail down the exhibition right now. There was an article, and I believe in the New York Times last year about masculinity in quilting. And one of the quilters they represented or they spoke with was a straight male, straight cisgender male. And he found it a compliment that he was often referred to as gay or thought of as gay. So I've actually seen some community building there. I think it does bring up the question of, I think there are two things happening with that. One is the perception of quilting as a female-only craft and art, which some of these projects and programs and groups are breaking down. I think that actually benefits the LGBTQ quilters because it breaks down those stereotypes that are associated with the craft and opens it up to more inclusivity among not only across gender, but also sexual orientation and gender identity and expression.
Great, thank you.
And there was one other at the very top, I think, that we missed, the queer quilting projects. Other queer quilting projects.
Right. You want to answer that?
Yeah, so Sienna asked if there were other queer quilting projects that I'm aware of that have been focused around Black, people of color, or white LGBTQ crafters collaborating. There are a few in human rights and quilting. They reference a 2012 project in San Diego by the San Diego LGBT Weekly columnist Andrew Printer, where he invited people to come together and quilt around memory of the LGBTQ experience in the 1980s as part of a project there at the San Diego Museum of Art. In addition, I found that, or I'm finding that a lot of individual projects happen in community center spaces, with LGBTQ community center spaces being kind of the hub of and having kind of community art related programs and projects. Those are more on individual spaces. And then there is a group in Vermont called Out in the Open in Vermont, which created an annual LGBTQ quilting tradition around, tying that history and tradition into knowledge and power, I think is their motto. Finally, the project I'm working on actually includes some community quilting aspects of it. I hope to, post-COVID, take this into places like Creating Change, which is the National LGBTQ Task Force annual convention. They have a community art space, and I hope to build in a community quilting space to further the tradition and history of quilting and that accessibility, and also take it into Pride festivals, Pride events, and local community centers throughout the South.
Welcome back, Christalena. That's the way of these Zoom things, isn't it? Cynthia asked if you could talk a little bit more about the interpersonal relations with the group that you were working with and their impact on you personally.
That's a really great question because they had a huge impact on me. They were incredibly welcoming to me, almost functioning like a family. As I was a foreigner in Hungary for a year, they, without a lot of conversation, just kind of scooped me up and would take me to their family events and kind of checked in on me a lot. But I think the biggest way that I was influenced really was through, I was really impressed by their sense of community and how much they cared about each other's art practices, creative practices. So, you know, if one of them needed to go to an exhibition or a workshop, like I said, they would take care of each other's children. And so it was the community, but it was also just on a technical level, they're so talented. And they taught me so much about this practice in a technical sense. So there was this interesting kind of dichotomy of them not necessarily understanding the pattern sources and the conceptual parts of quilting that I am really interested in and that I've researched and that I teach from. But they had this kind of like high level skill that we both, that's where the exchange really kind of happened, was over those two things. But on the personal level, yeah, they really kind of took me in. When I went to that community center in Aldio that I showed a picture of, they wouldn't let me take the bus there alone. Somebody took the bus to me, sat with me on the bus, and then they took me back. I mean, this is a level of formality and care and just sort of making sure that, you know, I knew where I was going and that I was comfortable, was just incredible to me. And I still stay in touch with a lot of them.
And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there were people from a couple of different countries in Central Europe. How did they find out about your work, and how did that work out?
Well, the call for participation was out on the Hungarian Patchwork Guild's website, and they have a really vibrant Facebook social media communication with each other too. Mm-hmm. And I was actually surprised at how closely they all use Facebook to communicate, which I think is true in that region of the world broadly. But I basically was shocked at who appeared to each event. I think that Hungary is known in that region for having the strongest quilting community. And so people in the surrounding countries kind of watch that. They aren't part of the guild, but they follow it and they know of their exhibition history, and they just kind of, you know, follow their work. They're really well known in that area.
That's so interesting. And so someone else has asked if there's other projects focus on community solidarity, international exchange, etc., in the contemporary West that you find particularly interesting or inspiring.
For me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love there are a lot of projects. I worked on the Monument Quilt project, which was designed around with the same format as the AIDS Quilt Names project. And that exhibited in May of 2019 on the Mall. It was a 4-year-long project of quilt making workshops that were based around the idea of community coming together to process sexual violence and abuse. So I held workshops at the School Art Institute, in community centers in Chicago. I held one in Budapest also. And it was really designed to change the public narrative around this topic of sexual abuse. And it was a really powerful project. And they exhibited on the Mall in the same way that the AIDS Quilt did. So that's kind of a big one that I've been involved with. There's the Social Justice Sewing Academy, which is also really inspiring. It's run primarily by teenagers that are sewing and quilting, doing workshops around social justice issues of the moment.
Great, thank you. Chris, somebody's asked if you've got any of your own quilts that you're able to show us.
I don't, unfortunately, here. I have some old quilts that I'm hoping to repair. You can see the small quilt piece from my grandmother there, but I don't have any here. There, most of the work I'm working on is actually at my home, and I'm in my office right now. So.
And so there's another question for you, Christalena. Sophia, my eyes are going funny. You know, you get over zoomed, right? Anyway, someone has asked about the double pink triangle quilt that you showed briefly from the community center. And they're asking if this was a reference to LGBTQ issues in Hungary.
That is a great question. And I asked related questions to the group, but Hungarian culture is very private, and it's not a country where LGBTQ can be out. So it's something that it's similar to the conversations around politics. They would talk to me one-on-one, but not in a group. And in that particular piece, they do a series of projects where they all learn everybody completes the same project together, and then they exhibit it. So they're all slightly different. So I would guess no on that particular piece, although it's a great question. But I think on the whole, it's something that is not part of a public discourse, unfortunately.
Okay. I think that is all of the questions that are in the Q&A. Do you want to ask each other questions?
I had a quick question for Christalena. On the finished quilt, there was a piece of text in the bottom, I think, right corner. I was just wondering what that translated to.
Oh, let me just make sure I'm looking at the right one.
I think it was SZAE.
Yeah, this was made by a local activist. It says, "You are free." Basically, the translation means "you are free," and with the question mark and the exclamation point, it also asks the question, "Are you free?" And that was made by a young woman. And the image is based on the Statue of Liberty in Budapest, which is a little bit of a contentious public sculpture. But yeah, there was a lot more text in the blocks that were made by students and activists and artists. But that is being turned into a kind of secondary quilt, actually. I'm in the process of that because we just had too many blocks for the one large quilt.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask you a question, Christalena, because I have done a lot of work on what in English-speaking countries were called paste prints, which were popular in the 18th century, but by the 19th century, they were being created more often in Central European countries. And I wondered, whether people talk to you about the issue of national pride with these blue fabrics.
Yeah, that was, I wanted to make a joke that's a whole separate paper because I did spend a lot of time digging into that history of the blue and white cloth and how it was used. Its sort of production has been consistent over 400 years, although, as I said, there are more or less dye houses. But I was told that during the 60s, a lot of the folk art traditions were deemed by the government to be unacceptable. Like, you can't have creative practices, right, during communism. So there were some that were taken, and there's a huge embroidery tradition in Hungary too. That's quite amazing. But a lot of these traditions were kind of taken by the government, and a few of them were given back, right? So not everything was necessarily acceptable. And the way that they affected the cake fester production was to shut down the dye houses and force what their production was going to be. So I had conversations with a well-known folk musician and historian about the folk music community, talking about this sort of waning and waxing of the popularities and when they were kind of allowed or restricted. And it seems like anything that was associated with community and group gathering was obviously restricted. And a lot of times this fabric was a part of folk costumes. So when it came to, in the 70s, there were these amazing folk dance revivals happening that were completely underground and secret. So then at that moment, the cake fester was also kind of seen as a political wearing. It was seen as a political move because everyone knew that it was being worn in secret, essentially. So that's something that I really want to keep exploring. I'm trying to go back actually to Hungary, but I really struggled with finding people that would talk openly with me about these things. The most information I got was from a friend of a quilter who would talk to me on the phone and not tell me her name. So
right.
A level of censorship that's happening, and I think some collective trauma about speaking openly about these topics. But right. It's a good question. I think there should be more scholarship on it. Really.
Yeah, really interesting. And it's interesting over a long period of history too, is when the 19th century romantic revivals were happening, and the issue of nationhood. And so it's it's been going backwards and forwards for a long time, which I think is so interesting. I don't think that there are any more questions. Do you have any more questions for each other?
I would love to ask Chris what I really enjoyed your presentation about the parts of history. You're pulling out these quilts, showing them to us, especially that reconciliation quilt from the Folk Art Museum in New York. But I'm curious, when you are working with quilters, is that part of the conversation? Is the history of the practice and some of these examples something that you're sharing with them, or are they already aware of this history?
It varies. The more of the conversations I'm having with these quilters is around their personal experiences with the craft. And a lot of those involve more traditional quilting that's happening in the home, family traditions of quilting and passing down, and not as much of a conversation or exploration of the history behind quilting. Ariana is a little bit different. She, I know, is in the group today. She works as a fine artist and works in the museum field, and obviously because of that, I think has a heightened awareness of that quilting history and fiber arts history. My other two quilters are not full-time quilters. They are they do this because they love it, and it's just a cherished part of their life. But one, works in the healthcare industry, and he is familiar. Ray, who grew up in Gee's Bend, obviously knows a lot of the history of Alabama quilting and a lot of the Black American history behind quilting. But we haven't had these conversations yet. That would be an interesting place to go in this further research. So.
Yeah, I mean, the question is really coming from my own experience of realizing that a lot of practitioners aren't aware of the practice, and we as academics and artists are interested in contextualizing our work within those histories, but it is always interesting to see you know, how other people enter that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how, I think, a lot of the things that they've experienced in their life show up in their quilting and in the choices they make, whether they do so consciously or unconsciously through color and style and technique. So I will add that to my additional research. Thank you.
There's always more to do, isn't there?
I know.
Right? Okay, well, thank you both very much. Those were excellent talks, and I think it's reflected in the number of questions and comments that we had. So thank you both very much. Thanks, everyone. We've got 65 people who attended this session, which is really, really great. And I just want to end by plugging the Textile Society of America. I have so much enjoyed being on the board. I've met such interesting people, been able to do such interesting things. And so I would encourage everyone to nominate themselves or someone else to serve on the board of the Textile Society of America, because I think it's a really, really great organization. So thank you very much.